Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, a place where history's most mysterious and chilling stories come alive. Tonight we are diving into one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. A story that feels part crime, part legend, and completely unforgettable. So dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let us travel back in time to the jazz-filled streets of New Orleans in the year 1918. It was a city bursting with rhythm, music, and culture. But beneath the joyful sound of trumpets and pianos, something far darker was moving in the night. People began whispering about a shadow someone or something that broke into homes while families slept. He never stole money or jewelry. Instead, he carried an axe, often one belonging to his victims, and vanished before dawn. The newspapers gave him a name that would echo through history: the Axeman of New Orleans. For over a year, the city lived in fear. Doors were double-bolted, windows nailed shut, and neighbors stayed awake through the night, listening for footsteps outside. Each new attack left investigators more confused, and the public more terrified. No clear motive, no solid evidence, no suspect ever caught. But then came the twist that turned this case into something almost unreal. One morning, a letter arrived at the Times-Picayune newspaper, supposedly written by the Axeman himself. In it, he claimed to be a spirit from the hottest realms, mocking the police for their failure to catch him. He ended with a chilling promise. On a specific night, he would visit the city again, and anyone not playing jazz music would meet their fate. That evening, New Orleans came alive in a way it never had before. Every bar, home, and street corner played jazz, from soft piano tunes to lively brass bands. The city that had been trembling in fear turned into one great symphony of survival. And that night, true to the letter's words, no one was attacked. When the music faded, so did the Axeman. The killings stopped. No arrest was ever made, and as decades passed, fact and folklore began to blur together, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Who was he? A killer hiding behind myth, a symbol of the fear that gripped a city, or something even stranger? Over a century later, the Axeman remains a ghost in the pages of history, a story that reminds us how, sometimes, the scariest monsters are not the ones we see, but the ones we can never find. The story truly began on a quiet night in May 1918. In a small corner grocery store owned by Joseph and Catherine Maggio, life had always followed a simple rhythm: long days of work, warm dinners, and the soft hum of jazz drifting through the humid New Orleans air. But that night, something shattered the peace forever. Just before dawn, a neighbor heard strange noises coming from the Maggio home. When he went to check, he found the door broken, and inside a scene that would mark the beginning of a nightmare for the entire city. Joseph and Catherine had been attacked in their sleep, their home showing no signs of robbery. The weapon, an axe, one that belonged to the family itself. The police arrived quickly, baffled by what they saw. There was no clear motive, no theft, no enemy anyone could name. Only a single clue remained. A small wooden panel from the back door had been removed, just enough for someone to slip inside silently. The news spread faster than the summer wind. Newspapers printed the headline in bold letters: "Axe Murderer Strikes in New Orleans." At first, some thought it was an isolated crime, a moment of madness, perhaps jealousy or revenge. But within weeks, another attack came. Then another. Each one carried the same eerie pattern: a house broken into, an axe taken from the victim's own home, and an escape into the darkness with no trace. Panic began to rise like floodwater. People stopped sleeping at night. Hardware stores ran out of locks, bolts, and even axes, not for attack but for protection. Some citizens claimed to see strange figures lurking near alleyways. Others swore they heard footsteps on their porches after midnight. The police, overwhelmed and unprepared, offered little comfort. Without fingerprints or modern forensics, All they could do was patrol the streets and hope to catch the Axeman in the act. But the killer seemed to move like smoke, always one step ahead. Newspapers began to feed the fear, publishing vivid descriptions, wild theories, and sensational letters from readers. Some believed the Axeman was targeting Italian immigrants. Others thought it was the work of a crazed drifter. Every rumor added another layer of terror to a city already on edge. By the end of 1918, New Orleans was no longer the same place. The music still played, but it now carried a nervous beat, every note echoing through streets where shadows seemed to move on their own. And as winter came, everyone asked the same question: would he return? Because one thing was certain, the Axeman was not finished yet. As the months passed, the Axeman's shadow seemed to stretch across every street in New Orleans. The attacks no longer felt random. They followed a strange, unsettling rhythm that no one could quite explain. Each new victim added another clue, yet somehow made the mystery even deeper. Most of those who fell under the Axeman's blade were small business owners, often grocers, butchers, or bakers, and many of them came from Italian immigrant families. These were hard-working people, well-liked in their neighborhoods, living quiet, modest lives. But that shared background soon became the focus of public fear. Some began to whisper that the killer held a grudge against Italians, perhaps part of a criminal network, or even connected to the Black Hand, a notorious group known for extortion and intimidation within immigrant communities. Yet, there was something different about this case. The Axeman never demanded money. He never left a message, at least not yet. He did not fit the image of a typical criminal. His actions were cold, methodical, and silent. He broke into homes by removing wooden panels from doors, a technique that allowed him to slip in unnoticed. The same type of weapon, an axe, always taken from within the house, was found at every scene. It was as if he wanted the police to see a pattern, to recognize his signature. Some survivors described the same haunting detail. They awoke in the dark to see a tall figure standing over them, face obscured by shadow. By the time help arrived, the attacker was gone, leaving no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing but fear. The city's detectives tried to connect the dots. They studied the locations, the times, the victims, but there was no logic to it. Wealthy or poor, young or old, the Axeman seemed to strike wherever he pleased. What linked the victims was not money or revenge. It was helplessness, the idea that no one, not even the most careful or pious, was safe. By early 1919, New Orleans had become a city of suspicion. Friends watched each other warily. People began sleeping in shifts, keeping lanterns lit through the night. Men sat by their doors with shotguns in their laps, waiting for a sound that never came. Still, the Axeman moved unseen, a ghost made of human fear. Each attack came like a storm, sudden, violent, and gone before anyone could react. Then, just when the city's terror was at its peak, something extraordinary happened. Something that would turn this case from a horror story into a legend that still echoes today. A letter arrived, and it was signed by the Axeman himself. In March 1919, New Orleans woke up to something unlike anything it had ever seen before. The Times-Picayune newspaper printed a long, chilling letter written by someone who claimed to be the very man who had haunted the city for months, the Axeman. It began with words that seemed almost theatrical, as if the writer wanted to both terrify and entertain. He claimed he was not human, but a spirit, a demon from the hottest realms, one who could not be caught by mortal hands. The letter mocked the police for their failure, taunted the citizens for their fear, and then delivered a warning that would shake the entire city. He declared that on the night of March 19, 1919, he would again walk the streets of New Orleans. But there was one strange condition. Any home or building where a jazz band was playing would be spared. That single line turned an already fearful city into something almost surreal. People did not know whether to laugh, panic, or pray. Some believed it was a cruel joke, others saw it as a supernatural curse. But one thing was certain: nobody wanted to take the risk. When the evening of March 19th arrived, New Orleans was transformed. From small corner bars to elegant dance halls, the sound of jazz filled every street. Pianists played with trembling hands, horn players poured their hearts into frantic melodies, and families gathered in their homes with phonographs spinning jazz records until dawn. That night became known as the night the city played jazz. And just as the letter promised, no one was attacked. In a strange twist of fate, fear had saved the city through music. For one night, terror gave birth to rhythm, and the people of New Orleans turned their fear into a celebration of life. It was as if the entire city had outsmarted the darkness by embracing what made it most alive, its music. But the mystery did not end there. The following days saw endless speculation. Was the letter truly from the Axeman, or just a cruel prank from someone enjoying the chaos? The handwriting, tone, and knowledge of the crimes all seemed too specific to ignore. Police analyzed it, newspapers reprinted it across the country, and people everywhere debated the strange figure who had managed to mix murder and music into one legend. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the Axeman faded again into the night. Weeks passed without another attack. The city exhaled, but the silence was uneasy because everyone knew that calm never lasted long in this story. And they were right. The Axeman would return one final time for an ending that was as mysterious as his beginning. The strange calm that followed the night of jazz did not last. For a few brief months, people began to believe that maybe the Axeman had finished his grim work, that perhaps the letter was his farewell, his final act of terror. But New Orleans was wrong. The quiet was only an illusion before the next storm. On August 10th, 1919, screams shattered the early morning silence of the city once again. This time, the victims were Steve and Sarah Cortimiglia, grocers in Gretna, a small town just across the river from New Orleans. Like the earlier attacks, their home showed signs of forced entry. The weapon, once again, was an axe. Steve and Sarah survived, but their young daughter did not. The brutality reignited the city's fear and reminded everyone that the Axeman was still out there. In the confusion and grief that followed, the case took a controversial turn. Sarah, in her hospital bed, named a man she knew, Frank Giordano, the son of a neighboring grocer, as the attacker. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the community. Frank was quickly arrested and convicted, though many believed he was innocent. Even the police themselves seemed unsure. The evidence was weak, and Sarah later changed parts of her statement. Years later, historians would agree that the case against him was built more on fear than proof. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the terror stopped. After the Cortimiglia attack, no more incidents followed the Axeman's pattern. No more doors were broken open, no more axes went missing, and no more letters appeared in the papers. It was as if the shadow had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions. Some believed he had been arrested for another crime, serving time under a different name. Others thought he had moved to another city or even another country, continuing his attacks elsewhere, unrecognized. A few whispered that he had died, perhaps by accident, perhaps by someone's secret hand, but one theory became almost as famous as the crimes themselves, that the Axeman was Joseph Mumfra, a known criminal tied to extortion and organized crime among Italian immigrants. According to one popular account, the widow of the Axeman's last known victim recognized Mumfra years later in Los Angeles, and in an act of vengeance, ended his life. Some newspapers repeated the story as truth, others dismissed it as pure legend. No official record ever proved the connection, and so the trail went cold. The police closed their files, the city moved on, and the legend began to grow. By the time the 1920s rolled in, New Orleans had found its rhythm again. Jazz played louder than ever, and the Axeman became part of the city's dark folklore. To this day, his name still drifts through those late-night stories told over candlelight and blues. A reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Long after the attacks ended, New Orleans was left with only one question: who was he? The mystery of the Axeman turned from a police investigation into a puzzle for generations of historians, detectives, and storytellers. Everyone had a theory, but none could ever be proven. The most widely discussed suspect was a man named Joseph Mumfre, sometimes spelled Monfray or Momfray. He was known in police circles as a small-time criminal, possibly connected to the Black Hand, an Italian-American extortion group active during that era. His record included threats, robberies, and intimidation. What made him even more suspicious was the eerie coincidence surrounding his death. According to one popular version of the story, the widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's supposed final victim, moved to Los Angeles after her husband's attack. There, she claimed to have recognized Mumfre as the man she had seen fleeing her home that night. In an act of vengeance, she allegedly confronted him and ended his life. The story spread quickly through newspapers, and many began to believe that the mystery was finally solved. But when modern historians tried to verify the tale, they ran into problems. No police record of Mumfre's death in Los Angeles could be found. The newspapers from that time did not match the details. Even the name Mumfre appeared inconsistently across reports. Some experts began to suspect that the entire story was a later invention, a convenient ending to a story that never truly had one. Other theories suggested the Axeman might have been a traveling worker, moving from city to city under different names, committing similar crimes that were never connected. A few even proposed that there was more than one Axeman, possibly copycats inspired by the panic and media attention. After all, fear spreads faster than truth, and in 1919, fear was the city's constant companion. Some psychological profiles suggest the Axeman was an intelligent but deeply disturbed individual, possibly driven by a desire for power and control rather than material gain. His pattern entering homes silently, using the victims, own tools, and disappearing without a trace suggested someone who enjoyed the sense of terror more than the act itself. But without modern forensics, fingerprints, or DNA, every theory remains speculation. The few surviving police reports are vague, inconsistent, and often lost to time. The identity of the Axeman, whether he was a single person or many, remains hidden behind a century of shadows. What makes his story endure is not just the crime, it is the mystery. The Axeman became more than a killer. He became a symbol of the unknown, of how fear itself can take on a life of its own. Even now, when jazz echoes through the streets of New Orleans, some say the rhythm carries a ghost, the memory of the man who once demanded that music be played to keep the darkness away. The Axeman may have vanished, but his shadow never really left New Orleans. Long after the attacks stopped, the city continued to feel the weight of what had happened, not only through fear but through a strange kind of transformation. The terror had changed something deep within the people, and the music that once echoed as a warning soon became a symbol of strength. When that infamous letter demanded that the citizens play jazz to save themselves, no one could have predicted what it would spark. In that one surreal night, the night of jazz, fear, and rhythm became inseparable. Families who had never touched an instrument before borrowed phonographs and records, playing music late into the darkness. Bands filled bars, restaurants, and even street corners. It was as though the entire city, trembling with fear, found comfort and protection in sound. And in doing so, New Orleans discovered its identity. Jazz was already part of its heartbeat, but the Axeman's strange challenge turned it into something even greater. A language of unity. The city learned that even in its darkest hour, music could drown out fear. People began to associate jazz not only with celebration, but with resilience, proof that no matter what haunted the streets, the spirit of New Orleans would always find a way to keep playing. Newspapers from that time captured this transformation vividly. Instead of stories filled only with panic, they began to feature headlines about the city's musicians, its street parades, and the sense of life returning to the community. For a city still recovering from war, disease, and poverty, the Axeman's letter ironically gave birth to one of its most defining cultural moments. Sociologists later noted that this period marked a turning point when fear turned into creativity. Jazz spread beyond New Orleans, reaching Chicago, New York, and eventually the world. But its roots, soaked in both joy and dread, remained forever tied to that night, when music became a shield. Of course, not everyone found peace so easily. Many immigrant families still carried scars not only from the crimes themselves, but from the suspicion that followed. Some people blamed their own communities. Others felt targeted simply for their heritage. The Axeman did not just terrorize individuals, he fractured trust, sowing paranoia between neighbors who once shared the same block, the same meals, the same faith. Yet somehow, out of that fear, something beautiful survived. New Orleans rebuilt itself, not through walls or weapons, but through sound, through trumpets, drums, and the rhythm of people refusing to be silent. In the end, the Axeman left behind more than mystery and sorrow. He left a reminder that even in the face of terror, the human spirit finds ways to create, to sing, and to keep dancing through the dark. As the years passed, the story of the Axeman began to slip from crime reports into folklore. What was once a terrifying series of real events slowly became a legend, retold in whispers, headlines, and later in songs, books, and even television. In 1919, newspapers had already played a huge role in shaping the public's fear. Their headlines screamed of a phantom killer, and their columns speculated endlessly about motives, identities, and even supernatural explanations. With every new attack, the paper sold more copies, and the Axeman grew larger than life. Reporters began adding dramatic language, describing him as a shadow that moves with the night, or a demon with a taste for fear. The facts, already scarce, became buried under waves of sensational storytelling. Over time, this exaggeration turned into myth-making. By the 1920s, writers and storytellers began to romanticize the case not as a story of grief, but as a strange dance between life, death, and jazz. The image of a mysterious figure, haunting a city that answered him with music, was too poetic to be forgotten. In many ways, the Axeman became part of New Orleans' cultural DNA, a symbol of how light and darkness coexist in the same city, on the same street. Then came Hollywood. Decades later, the Axeman appeared in pulp novels, radio shows, and TV series. His story was retold with new twists, sometimes as a ghost, sometimes as a musician, sometimes as a vengeful spirit, returning to punish the city that forgot him. In each version, the line between fact and fiction grew thinner. But perhaps the most haunting version of all was not in film or fiction. It was in music. Jazz musicians and blues singers wrote songs about the Axeman, turning him into a character that reflected both danger and rhythm. The most famous example came in 1919 itself. The mysterious Axeman's Jazz Don't Scare Me Papa, a real jazz song recorded soon after the letter appeared. It captured the bizarre atmosphere of the time, playful yet fearful, a city laughing at its own terror. Historians today see the Axeman legend as a mirror of its time. It reveals how fear spreads faster than truth, how media can shape monsters, and how societies turn tragedy into stories to help make sense of what they can't understand. Whether he was a man, a myth, or something in between, the Axeman became one of America's earliest examples of how true crime and storytelling can merge into legend, a blend of history, horror, and humanity. And like all good legends, it never really ends. Every few years, a new book, a new documentary, or a new theory appears, each one trying to unmask the faceless figure who once made New Orleans dance with fear. Over a century has passed since the Axeman vanished into history, and yet his identity remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. Many have asked the same question: why has this case never been solved? The answer lies not only in the Axeman's cunning, but also in the limitations of the time itself. In 1919, criminal investigation was still in its infancy. Fingerprint databases were rare. DNA testing did not exist, and most crime scenes were handled with little regard for preservation. Detectives often walked through evidence, moved objects, and even allowed reporters to enter homes before the police work was done. By modern standards, nearly every Axeman crime scene was compromised before the first officer had even taken notes. There were no security cameras, no neighborhood surveillance, no forensic labs to compare fibers or prints. Witnesses were the only source of information, and most of them, understandably, were traumatized, confused, or half asleep when they caught a glimpse of the attacker. Some said he was tall, others swore he was short, some claimed he wore a hat, others insisted he did not. None of their testimonies ever matched perfectly. The police also struggled with another major obstacle: fear. The entire city was paralyzed by panic, and every citizen seemed to have their own theory, rumor, or supposed sighting. False leads flooded the station. Angry mobs threatened innocent people. Anyone who looked suspicious, especially if they were an immigrant or a stranger, could easily become the next suspect. Adding to the chaos was the social tension of the era. Many of the victims were Italian grocers, which fueled speculation of ethnic targeting or organized crime connections. The media amplified this theory, but investigators never found concrete links to any specific group. The truth may have been much simpler or far more complex. When the final attack occurred in 1919, the police had little more than a handful of broken doors, blood-stained axes, and scattered witness statements. No fingerprints matched, no confessions held up, and no one could definitively connect one attack to another with certainty. The cases slowly went cold, one by one, until they were quietly closed. Then came the passage of time, the true eraser of evidence. Paper files decayed, police archives were destroyed by floods and fires, and even the names of key witnesses faded from record. By the time modern researchers revisited the case in the late 20th century, almost nothing remained to analyze. In the end, the Axeman was not just a man who escaped the law. He was a mystery built in a time before science could catch up. And that is perhaps why his legend still breathes, because what we can't prove, we keep imagining. Some mysteries end with answers. Others, like this one, end with silence, a silence that still echoes through the dark corners of New Orleans. A century later, the shadow of the Axeman still lingers not in the streets of New Orleans, but in the minds of those who try to understand him. Modern historians, criminologists, and even amateur sleuths have returned to this mystery with new tools, hoping to uncover what the detectives of 1919 could not. In the age of digital archives, researchers have scoured thousands of pages of old newspapers, police records, and court transcripts. They have remapped the locations of every known attack, cross-referenced the names of victims and witnesses, and even examined regional crime patterns across Louisiana. Some experts noticed that similar axe-related crimes occurred in nearby cities around the same years, suggesting that the Axeman might have been a transient worker or drifter moving through the South. Others, like historian Miriam C. Davis, approached the case from a cultural and psychological angle. Her book, The Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story, explored not only the crimes, but the society that shaped them, a time of racial tension, poverty, and cultural change. She argued that understanding the Axeman means understanding New Orleans itself, a city alive with music and beauty, but also haunted by inequality and fear. In recent years, technology has allowed investigators to revisit old mysteries with modern methods, DNA testing, forensic genealogy, and data analysis. But in the case of the Axeman, there is simply nothing left to test. The evidence, if it ever existed, is long gone. There are no preserved samples, no authentic photographs of the crime scenes, not even reliable autopsy records. The only thing left is the paper trail, and even that, scattered and fading. Still, the fascination continues. True crime enthusiasts have built online communities dedicated to piecing together every clue, every name, every rumor. Podcasts, documentaries, and independent researchers have kept the story alive, treating it as both a crime to solve and a cultural riddle. Each new generation rediscovers the Axeman, not just as a figure of fear, but as a reflection of how societies respond to the unknown. Interestingly, modern behavioral profilers have revisited the case through the lens of contemporary criminology. Many agree that if the Axeman existed today, his behavior would fit the pattern of a power-oriented offender, someone who sought dominance and fear more than money or revenge. His unpredictability, public taunting, and sudden disappearance all suggest a mind that craved attention but feared capture. Yet, despite the studies, theories, and debates, the truth remains out of reach. The Axeman has become less of a suspect and more of a story, a mirror reflecting both the flaws and the fears of early 20th century America. And perhaps that is why the legend still lives, because every time someone plays a jazz tune in New Orleans, a small part of that century-old story stirs again, not in terror but in memory. Today, more than 100 years after his final strike, the Axeman of New Orleans has become something far greater and far stranger than a nameless killer. He has evolved into a cultural symbol, a character woven into the identity of New Orleans itself. To many, he represents not just an unsolved mystery, but the city's eternal dance between darkness and light. In most American cities, a story like this might have faded into history, but New Orleans is different. It is a place where myths breathe as easily as music, where tragedy and art often share the same stage. The Axeman's legend survived because it fit perfectly into the city's rhythm, mysterious, passionate, and endlessly complex. Writers have reimagined him in novels, screenplays, and radio dramas. Television series such as American Horror Story, Coven brought him back as a spectral figure, a phantom tied to jazz, vengeance, and the spirit of the city. In these retellings, he is no longer merely a man with an axe, but a ghostly reminder of human fear and fascination. Each generation reinvents him, reshaping the story to reflect its own anxieties about violence, justice, and the unknown. But beyond pop culture, the Axeman's presence lingers in subtler ways. He has become a metaphor for the hidden sides of society, the violence that can emerge from poverty, prejudice, or desperation. His story forces us to look not only at the mystery of one man, but at the deeper truths of the time that created him. The Axeman also occupies a strange moral space in folklore. Unlike the heroes or villains of most tales, he is neither entirely human nor fully mythical. He belongs to that rare category of legends born from real events, where fact ends and imagination begins. Much like Jack the Ripper in London, or the Zodiac in California, the Axeman stands as a reminder of how mystery can outlive certainty. And then there is the music, the eternal companion to his legend. Jazz was not destroyed by the fear he created. It thrived because of it. The very night that was meant to terrify the city became a celebration of resilience. That moment, when fear gave birth to sound, remains one of the most poetic intersections of history and art. Today, when jazz musicians play late into the New Orleans night, some say the Axeman story echoes in the background, not as a curse, but as a strange kind of blessing. A reminder that life, even when shadowed by darkness, always finds a rhythm of its own. The Axeman is gone, but his legend lives not as a symbol of death, but as a strange, haunting part of what makes New Orleans unforgettable. More than 100 years have passed since the Axeman of New Orleans last walked the city's streets. The houses he once stalked have crumbled, the witnesses have faded into history, and the sound of jazz that once saved a city now drifts through time like a memory. Yet somehow, the story still lives retold in every book, every film, and every late-night conversation about the mysteries that will never be solved. Perhaps that is because the Axeman was never just one man. He was, and still is, a symbol, a reflection of what happens when fear takes hold of an entire community. His story reminds us how people search for meaning when reason fails, how even terror can transform into legend, and legend into identity. In many ways, New Orleans was both the stage and the survivor of this tale. The same streets that once trembled in silence now celebrate music, light, and life. The same city that feared a monster learned to sing through its fear, and in doing so, became stronger. That, perhaps, is the real ending of the story. Not the identity of the killer, but the resilience of the people he tried to break. Every few decades, someone claims to have found new evidence. A forgotten newspaper, a hidden name, a new theory about who the Axeman really was. But none of it has ever been proven. The truth, like the man himself, slips through history's fingers. Maybe he was Joseph Mumfre. Maybe he was someone the world never even suspected. Or maybe, as the letter once claimed, he was something darker, a spirit that feeds on fear, disappearing only when the city chose to answer with music instead of panic. What makes the Axeman so unforgettable is not his violence, but the story that grew around him. A story where death and jazz, horror and beauty danced side by side under the same moonlight. A story that reminds us that history is not always about answers sometimes. It is about the echoes that never fade. And so, the mystery remains unsolved, unbroken, and alive in every note of New Orleans jazz. If you walk through the French Quarter late at night, past the glow of the old street lamps and the distant sound of a trumpet, you might feel a chill that is not from the wind. Not because the Axeman is still there, but because his story still whispers through the city that refused to be silent. Thank you for watching and for journeying with us through one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, and join us next time as we uncover another shadow from the past. Until then, keep your lights low and your music playing